So I don't understand where all this, everybody's,
Nobody does.
where is it if we don't have a need for expanded urban growth boundary?
So I actually called your office some years ago, and they gave me a couple minutes.
Always
Like,
good TV program.
I think you guys can, because I'm sure that they're not ready.
You know our clock says to say 6 o'clock, but it is actually 6:02 if you guys want to get started.
Anyway,
Sure.
very helpful. Yeah, and because I knew, the neighbor.
All right, you ready for roll call?
All right. Call to order City of Coos Bay Planning Commission meeting, Tuesday, September 13th, 2022. We do a roll call for attendance.
Yes, Commissioner Terry?
Here.
Commissioner Marino?
Here.
Commissioner Berg?
Here.
Commissioner Gary?
Here.
Commissioner Davis? Commissioner Stevens?
Here.
Commissioner Miller?
Here.
Thank you.
All right, we have some meeting minutes to adopt from August 9th, 2022. Can we get a motion to adopt those minutes?
Move to adopt them as written.
Second.
Perfect. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right, and at this point, we'll we'll have a staff report probably on the housing needs analysis update, and then we'll open the public hearing.
Hello, Commissioners. This is Carolyn. Nice to see you all. This evening, you are convening after your last meeting on this same topic, and we are going to, I'm going to kind of follow along the staff report that I prepared, but I do have some additional information that's not in this written report. As you noted, we're going to make a presentation. That'll be Jake, and open the public hearing. One of the things that's a little different is that we received information from Mr. Al Johnson yesterday regarding the content of what you received from staff and from LCOG. He submitted two fairly lengthy, actually three fairly lengthy memos that staff and LCOG staff also, we really need more time to go through those. Sorry, phone dropped. So what we're recommending is that we go ahead and provide a presentation based on what was set up for tonight's meeting. Jake will touch very lightly on what was submitted, but like I said, we need more time to digest that and get back to you. You would then open the public hearing. You could discuss it. All the information that's been provided. And we would like you then to continue the public hearing to your October 11th meeting. Your recommendations would then move on to council at their first meeting in November, which would be November 1. So that is what we would like to recommend. Going back to your last meeting, you had requested some additional information regarding development potential in the floodplain and the urban growth boundary. And your comments were shared with the council when they met on August 16th. Jake and Rachel followed up on that with DLCB and can probably provide some additional information. In short, you have in front of you the entire comprehensive plan with the draft amendments in them. I'd like to note that there's a lot of big black spots where there's they're like holders for existing maps. There aren't any maps that we're introducing in this meeting. These were simply old maps that did not translate technically when we when the information was transmitted and then included in the packet. So apologize for that, and we'll clean that up as we move closer to council action. There's also a summary of the comprehensive plan draft amendments that was made it, I think, much easier to go through, that Rachel put together. She did a really good job. I think it makes it a lot easier than wading through that entire strikeout version document. And then finally, there's the draft urban growth boundary expansion memo that has been prepared, and Jake will talk about that as well. But we're here tonight to go over these comprehensive plan draft amendments, as well as the urban growth boundary expansion memo. But like I said, we want to recommend that you continue the public hearing to October 11th to give us time to go back and take a hard look at the comments from Mr. Johnson. So I think I've captured everything that I need to say, but I am available. I'd like to hand off to Jake and Rachel at this point.
Thank you, Caroline. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. It's good to be with you again, commissioners. Thank you for the time. I'm going to share my screen here 1 second, provide a presentation for you. Okay, can everybody see that? Could I get an audible? Yeah, we're seeing that?
Yep.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to lay out just a quick agenda here. I think Carolyn did a great job of essentially providing the context, so we'll move through that fairly quickly. Then we're going to present some of these comprehensive plan amendments to give you a sense for the amendments that we've put together that essentially are the implications of the housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory. I'll provide a little context for that too, because there's some important context, I think, for considering those at this point in time. And obviously we're available for questions and discussion. So I'll just add to what Carolyn mentioned. One of the things that you requested in our last meeting was a little bit of follow-up on development in the floodplain. I'm going to give you a kind of quick answer to that specific question. And then I want to give just a little more nuance. I was actually planning to go over in reasonable detail this UGB memo based on the information that we received from Mr. Johnson that you've seen, the 3 memos that we, or 3 documents that we received. I think it makes the most sense, being respectful of your time, and just the efficiency and cohesion of that conversation would be to, as Carolyn suggested, to table that conversation so that we can review the details that Mr. Johnson brought up, make sure that we've come to an understanding of what the concerns are, try to reconcile things that we feel should be reconciled, and then come back with something just a little bit more cohesive. The thing that I did want to say about the UGB memo that hopefully you've received, some of you hopefully have been able to read, is that in this context, UGB expansion, and by this context, I mean when you're conducting a housing needs analysis and a buildable lands analysis, UGB expansion can be sort of a vulnerable element that adds a bit of confusion. The expansion component that we sort of wired into this project explicitly was to provide some context for the process itself. UGB expansions are very prescribed in Oregon land use law. So there's a very prescriptive set of statutes and rules and goals that are committed specifically to those processes. And so the memo was intended to be a way to bring the community and decision makers kind of up to speed with this process. It's a kind of inherent follow-on to the housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory, but it is a very distinct and involved process. And so it's a project in and unto itself. So that memo really is about providing some context, some understanding for how UGB expansion works in the Oregon system, and then putting the Coos Bay housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory into that context to kind of show this is how this would work. So there's a lot of it in there that's illustrative. It's very much intended to be an exercise, a thought exercise in how UGB could commence. So today, I don't intend to go through that in detail, but to sort of punt that to October when we can really put something cohesive together that I think will just make more sense to run through it. We need more time to look at some of the information we got last night and earlier today. I did want to touch really quickly on the development in the floodplain, though we can revisit that in more detail as well. We reached out with some of the Planning Commission's questions about one of the things we were looking at was how floodplains could be used as a constraint. And I think part of that question was how far can we lean into floodplain as a constraint? Our current housing needs analysis, or rather our current buildable lands inventory, uses a 50% constraint for floodplains. That proportion allows the community to make some assumptions that aren't property specific and they're not comprehensive. So they're not saying, well, you just can't build in the floodplain. They're saying what we imagine will happen is that some properties it will make sense potentially that could pencil out to develop in the floodplain, and in others it won't happen. And the 50-50 is a fairly standard percentage. So there was some question about, well, can we kind of noodle with the percentages a little bit to say, oh, can we do 60-40, 80-20? DLCD was a little elusive about the proportion knob turning, but one of the pieces of research that we thought was meaningful to bring back to this group was that, let's say you went 100% floodplains, just based on how the buildable lands inventory is currently constituted, what you would add is about 13 acres to unbuildable land. So in kind of the larger scheme of things, it's actually not a particularly impactful knob to turn. And so, you know, there's the, is it worth the effort? Is it worth the sort of risk of leaning into those proportions? And so I want to just report back some of what we heard about that question and some of the analysis we did to kind of try to understand the relevance of it. So with that having been addressed, I want to bring us to tonight, which is essentially looking at the comprehensive plan amendments. The other context that I wanted to provide for that is that in 2020, the city adopted a housing needs analysis. And in 2021, the city engaged in a project to do some code and comprehensive plan updates. I think this is really important because it's important to look back in the very recent past to see how the review of housing needs in the recent past actually implemented some pretty extensive changes to the comprehensive plan and the development code. That included things like establishing a 20% maximum for slope for development of properties. It also instituted density increases in in almost every zone within the city of Coos Bay. So there were a lot of things that were enacted out of the findings of that. And so we're now taking another look at, through this update, some comprehensive plan amendment concepts. But I want to sort of acknowledge that the efforts that we've taken within the last few years are more comprehensive than what you see in this particular effort. So the plan amendments can really be broken down into two categories that we've provided. So the way that the comprehensive plan is set up is there are these narrative sections which kind of set a context. They establish kind of some baseline assumptions, introduce concepts, and then there's sections where policy and strategy are introduced explicitly. So we have some proposed amendments to both of those. I had a note here to also mention the blacked out sections on the comprehensive plan map. Sorry about that. It was a tech issue that, as Carolyn noted, there's no changes that are hidden in those blackened sections, but it's confusing, so sorry for that. As Carolyn mentioned, Rachel prepared a summary. This is going to be yet a higher level of summary to just essentially introduce, at least initially, some concepts. Section 4.4 is about natural disasters and hazards. So what the plan amendments, proposed plan amendments suggest are adding new subsections. So these are disasters and hazards that weren't mentioned at all aren't currently mentioned in the comprehensive plan. So landslides, liquefaction, and tsunami danger. So what this update would do in this narrative section is essentially just introduce these as hazards to give some context for what kinds of danger they propose or introduce, and also that they exist. To that point, earthquakes are mentioned in the current comprehensive plan, but they're mentioned as not providing or introducing any major hazard. So the language is amended as proposed to indeed describe how earthquakes do pose a major hazard in Coos Bay and their relationship with the Cascadia subduction zone and tsunamis. The section around housing is something that you can understand how that would be impacted. This is a narrative that essentially describes some kind of baseline elements. In the 2020 update, essentially we took key portions of the executive summary from the housing needs analysis and inserted those as the narrative to introduce housing. And something similar is proposed for that section with these updates. Urban growth management. So this is the portion of the comprehensive plan that addresses managing urban growth. And so UGB expansion is a component of this. So essentially we introduce some key figures that the housing needs analysis concludes and update those. So it's not an extensive update, but it does bring it up to current understanding. And then section 6.2 does something very similar, essentially updates the narrative to include the 2022 content around residential lands. So some of the policy strategy amendments, those are the narrative amendments that kind of, or let's say qualitative things, and the policies sort of get to a sort of finer point. So the existing language around flood-prone areas in Coos Bay was really identified as being insufficient right now. One of the things that we're always trying to balance, and you may remember this from the code and plan updates that we did last year, was that the plan is not really a place to get too terribly specific. The development code is where actual regulation, implementation regulations are put into effect, and that's where you really want to be more specific. That's the instrument that the staff uses to go out and actually implement on the ground, whereas the plan is the empowering document that essentially directs and empowers the city to implement those elements or include those implementation elements. So natural resource and hazards strategy 6 we're proposing that some language in here be changed essentially to tie it more closely to the National Flood Insurance Program. You see, the original standard wasn't really tied to that. That's become increasingly more synced. We're looking for the empowerment to implement development code regulations that are tied to this reality of the National Flood Insurance Program. So this allows the plan to more directly empower the city to instigate those sorts of regulations. We have a couple of these that have options that essentially want to provide some consideration for decision-making bodies on. The real distinction, I wouldn't say that these are two clear pathways, one going in one direction and another totally in the other. It's really about, they're both saying more or less the same thing, but one's getting to, let's say, a finer point, whereas the other is providing a little bit more flexibility. So the first option here, and this is just adding language essentially, that says rather than just acknowledging that building codes, state building codes and agencies would require building standards to prevent essentially impacts from these hazards, it goes beyond, adds a little more context to say in areas of known hazard, the city may require identification of potential dangers posed by environmental hazards, may require site investigations, including but not limited to a geologic hazard area evaluation by a registered geologist or engineer at the applicant's cost. That would be the slightly more detailed language, being a little bit more specific about certain things. The other one that's a little less specific is the city also recognizes, so this would be in place of what you see in yellow above. The city also recognizes the value of identification of natural hazards as a part of the land use permitting process and will adopt development code requirements specifying identification of and mitigation for potential dangers posed by environmental hazards. So that's just punting a little bit more, let's say, indirectly to the development code, saying this policy, this strategy essentially empowers the city to, within the development code, establish permitting processes and steps that essentially mitigate potential dangers. This is another variation on that same theme. This is looking at essentially introducing a new strategy that's related specifically to earthquake and tsunami. So to protect life, minimize damage, and facilitate rapid recovery from a local source Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami, the city shall continue its support for tsunami preparedness and related resilience efforts, take reasonable measures to protect life and property to the fullest extent feasible from the impact of a local source Cascadia tsunami. And then one of two options being proposed here. Use the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries tsunami inundation maps applicable to Coos Bay to develop tsunami hazard resiliency land use measures and regulations specific to building construction and location relative to new development. Or the version that is a little bit, again, a little less direct, use the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries tsunami inundation maps applicable to Coos Bay to adopt development code tsunami hazard resilience land use measures. So just a little less wordy, a little less, in some ways, enabling a little more flexibility, but being a little less specific. So again, this is an area of hazard that currently does not have policies or strategies related to it. We've been talking about implementing restrictions, or rather identifying tsunami vulnerable areas as being unbuildable. So these are the steps that the city needs to take to indeed back up that unbuildable dynamic and to identify areas that are truly vulnerable to tsunamis and earthquakes, and ensure that those areas are protected from property damage and loss of life, heaven forbid. So under urban growth management, another policy and strategy or strategy amendment, this is the policy and strategy sections have their own sort of narrative section. So this isn't the policy itself explicitly stated, but this is kind of setting the stage of the problem. I only took the last paragraph of this, and this is something that we've talked about at our last planning commission meeting. We talked about it with the city council. It's something that we're curious about decision makers' interest in introducing as something that, again, the city through the plan is empowered to investigate further. And so this is the narrative section to sort of tease up this next proposed policy. So because Coos Bay has buildable land capacity to support the city's anticipated residential growth, the city cannot justify a residential UGB expansion, and annexing county properties into Coos Bay is not feasible consistent with state law. Instead, Coos Bay may consider an alternative process called a UGB land exchange, which can allow a city to replace difficult to develop areas with land better suited to meeting the city's urban land needs and ensuring developable land to accommodate future housing needs. So this is a concept that's been sort of vetted with DLCD at a high level. It's something that is enabled through Oregon administrative rule, mentioned specifically. It's something that some other communities in the area, peer communities to a degree of Coos Bay, have pursued. And so this is language that could be contemplated again to set up the following proposed policy or strategy. Coos Bay shall consider the use of UGB land exchange as a means to replace environmentally constrained land with land better suited to meeting the city's urban land needs. So that would be a distinct plan, anchored directive to look into this further. One final component of the strategies that we wanted to call out was there is a policy that had a very specific aim that has been removed because it's essentially outdated as a specific site specific, essentially a project. So that is the plan amendments at this point, and not sure if we want to do questions now or open up the hearing first, but I'm happy to proceed however the Planning Commission chooses. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you guys have any questions for Jake? Go ahead.
With those land exchanges, are those acre for acre, or is there has there been any of those successfully done? That is it, if we designate 3 acres of difficult to develop, does that bring in a straight across the board 3 acres, or is it weighted one way or the other?
Good, excellent question. As I understand it, it is development capacity for development capacity in a strictly, so if one area is unbuildable, so it's essentially acres for acres. But it is the key variable is adding development capacity. And so Sutherland is a community that has successfully completed a land exchange. Their sort of case study is, I would say, the most promising. The constraint that they were up against was very similar to Coos Bay's, in that a lot of the areas that they had originally included in their urban growth boundary had slopes. And the premise there, at least the way the DLCD has described it, is that essentially it was an objective mistake to include those lands within the urban growth boundary. The lands within the urban growth boundary are intended for urban uses, and if they objectively can't be used for urban uses as such and are set aside for such use, then you can implement an exchange. And that exchange is the piece that always makes heads swell a little bit, is that literally you're sending land back to the county and then bringing in county land. So it takes a pretty good collaborative effort, but the statute, as I understand it, is a acre for acre, but enabling, the clear point is to bring in developable land.
Following up on that, you're basically taking the boundary of the city, adjusting it, and sending lands back out to the county, and assimilating other lands that are more developable, correct?
That's right.
Can you show one example of that? How it could work?
Was that a question? Is there an example of how it could work? Is that what the question was?
I mean, I'm just looking at this map here, and it's sort of blurry before my eyes here, and I'm trying to figure out what would be an example of where you would take away something and then extend the boundary around something else? Where would that, what's an actual example of that, if you could make one?
I can think of
Ken?
one to the southwest here, above the high school, up onto that hillside. Very challenging, going up to the top, dropping down into the valley.
Yeah, we go back to the county,
Yes,
and you take that in what?
Jim, if you look maybe on page 5 of this memo, I think they've outlined some potential areas that they could bring in.
Oh, sure, show off how you read the whole thing.
Just while we were here, Jim.
I think the example that comes to mind is the one that the commissioner mentioned, and trying really hard to be as unspecific as possible and focus on the kind of principle, because this is a concept at this point and it's meant to be illustrative, but there are areas in the community that are zoned for certain types of development that have significant pockets of area that the development code and best practice really prohibit from being developed, particularly with the kind of development that is needed.
So, well, let me,
And so I think the question of what areas might present opportunities, certain areas come to mind. The question about looking outward is complex, and I don't know, beyond sort of the illustrative examples that we provided, that's about as good an answer I think as can provide at this point.
well, okay, let me try to phrase this another way. I guess what I'm imagining is that you would have parts of the existing city that would go back into the county because they weren't buildable. Then to bring in others, I'm sort of imagining pockets of county within the city and things like that, sort of resulting from something like that, or maybe I'm way off on this.
Yeah, I would guess it is a good question. It came up, I can't remember if it was internally or otherwise, but there's definitely the clean way to think about this, which is maybe too simple, but it's hard for me to imagine a process where a smattering of aggregated chunks of land are returned to the county and some odd assemblage of properties are brought in. I think you really have to have a pretty good aggregated area of property to make it justifiable. And I think that's the examples that I'm aware of, that's how it's proceeded.
I had a comment to make too, Jake, on that. Right now, we're talking in the context of land mass, but one thing that's also very important when cities consider any property is the provision of services. So the fact that there's a large parcel of land available is one thing, but another element that would most have to be considered would be how would that land be served by city services, water, sewer, roads, etc. So the land itself is just one variable, but it's important that we don't forget how could those be served. So there'd have to be some kind of an assemblage of criteria to accomplish this.
And thank you. That's an excellent trigger for an important point that I glossed over in my own mind, which is that the expansion is still subject to expansion criteria. So it's not this is our favorite place to go. You still are subject to the priorities that are outlined by the state. And so that becomes the criteria for expansion still, as I understand it.
Thanks.
Any further questions?
Is 1, 2, and 3 on that map on page 5 there? Is that the Coquel reservation land there?
That's Barview.
Oh, it could be. Yeah, I don't know. The point there was to be as illustrative, kind of high level as we possibly could be. The task was given to one of our GIS staff, and we provided a few parameters and didn't include whether it's tribal or not. So it could very well be.
Yeah, I think the bulk of that acreage right there is all reservation land for the Coquel Indian tribe.
Yeah, and obviously that would have implications for the realistic, certainly you'd be,
And
there are ways to remove certain areas just out of the gate from being considered that meet certain standards, and that could very well be one of them.
do you have a database of all the 3,254 available units within the existing UGB? Do you have that parcel list?
It was a little soft, but what I think you asked was, is there a data set that conveys the properties where all of the units that are characterized are?
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that is as purely one for one as that is, but there's something that surely exists that is very close to that. I don't think there's anything that is explicitly that.
I mean, it just seems like a really specific number there, so I'm just curious if we could see the raw data behind that number.
You're talking about our conclusion of units at this point.
The estimated new unit capacity
Yeah.
of 3,254 units within the existing urban growth boundary.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not, the exercise is not as specific as taking everything parcel by parcel and putting a structure on it. It's conceptually that, but it's meaning the GIS analysis that is conducted takes the buildable properties, it takes into account where there are constraints, it takes into account properties that have infill potential, and then populates them sort of in an aggregate sense into those areas. Obviously, it does so in a manner that would prohibit, let's say, 13 properties that are slivers that altogether constitute, say, a buildable lot, and then we put a house there. So there's provisions in place that would prohibit that kind of an assumption about the acreage that's generated. So we're always talking about footprints that could accommodate a structure, but the way that the actual analysis works is not to physically place and generate a map that shows here's where all the structures go.
So what was like the minimum lot size in this?
So the methodology's spelled out fairly thoroughly in the HNA that describes all these different categories that properties are put into. So partially vacant, infill potential. So there's kind of the first swing through, which is fairly straightforward acreages that can accommodate. And then you have these other categories, and those are spelled out. So one example would be properties that are an acre or more are assumed to have, if they're an acre or more, they're assumed to have at least a half acre of developable land, just from an infill potential perspective, looking 20 years out. So that would be one example. The methodology spells out within that those categories how different pots of characterized land are assumed to accommodate development and the densities. Which I'm happy to talk anyone through that or look more closely at it.
Any further comments? Should we open the public hearing? We'll open the public hearing. Did you have comment?
Jim Barron's, Fulton Street, Coos Bay. The question about the vacancy rate, the consultant answered to the city council. They were using the last census, and that's how they came up with that 8%. We all know that that 8% is not even close to reality, but these guys have to do projections based on what they have that they can actually latch onto. But he did an excellent job of explaining that to the city council. That came off. I have really mixed feelings about this, and one of the reasons I have mixed feelings about this is that we have to find people that are willing, outside the urban growth boundary, to be included. Being able to take someone who, for example, the ridge he described up behind here, that's probably on forestry deferral right now. So an argument from that landowner, well, you've denied me the ability to go build houses. No, you're on forestry deferral and we're just swapping forest land. A little bit flatter. So kind of to explain this a little bit more simpler, forestry deferral, some of you folks know, is a big tax break on property taxes. Forestry deferral within the city limits of Coos Bay, and I've already found a couple of pieces, okay? We lose money as a city. We are unable to fund our services because they are not paying for those services. They're on forestry deferral, all right? I don't think we have any ag deferral in Coos Bay, but I have found forestry deferral. And those people need to be out of our city limits. They're not urban people, that's forest. We need urban stuff in to build on. The stormwater question and stormwater mitigation, when we went and looked, he found more acreage when they looked at 13. We found about 10 more on floodplain. We didn't find 13. They did a better job of looking than we did. But stormwater mitigation right now is not an issue in this community. In the next 5 to 20 years, our rules on how we handle our street runoff, our gutter runoff, all of that stuff is going to become much, much more structured. And I feel personally that we've clawed as much property with slopes, floodplains, stormwater runoff that we can with the rules and the data sets we're working with. But down the road, that's going to harshen up. We will not probably, in less than 10 years, not have a single culvert going into this bay that doesn't go through a swale or some sort of holding system. It's coming. There's no way around it. Land exchange, to me, is going to be the solution to a lot of this. Whatever we decide conceptually, which was what he's talking about, and then the development code part of this needs to be written in such a way that it goes through like Sutherland. And there's some other examples that he probably could cite. But it needs to go through. We have people owning land that realistically it's forest land. It's never going to get built on in anyone's lifetime. It's made for trees. And we need to trade for stuff that can be built on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm assuming no further public comment? I think.
Online?
Oh, online?
I don't know. There's a couple people there.
Okay. No? Okay. So further planning commission discussion? Because of the additional information that we received at 1:30 today, I think we have to keep this going. I wasn't able to read it.
146 pages or something?
Yeah.
need
We
a,
have 45 acres that we, that's buildable that we can use, and we're good to 2042 or whatever it is. I guess, why are we discussing this? I'm a little confused.
so the point is that we exchange lands inside the city for properties outside the city that can be developed.
I guess my first question is, who would want to do that? Who would want to exchange, unless it's county, unless it's already publicly owned? I don't, I've got property that's outside the city that's on services. The water board services it, the Bunker Hill Sanitary services it, DP&L services it. Why would I want to be in the community? Why would I want to be in the city? I don't know that you're going to get those people. Maybe somebody with a forest, they might be able to trade, but it just seems like we had a real shortage of residential properties, and now we're saying we've got 45 acres and we're good for the next 20 years. I guess I'm kind of confused in reading this.
Madam Chair. If we didn't know that, what would we have to do tonight?
The purpose of this exercise and the reason we're going through these hoops, in my view, is that we do have people, Mr. Berg brought them up, 400 acres, and he would love to be able to have that inside the urban growth boundary so his client could sell it and develop it, or develop it on its own, or whatever. And we have people who are not paying their fair share, sitting on timber deferral within our city limits. So that timber deferral goes out in the county where timber belongs, and people that want to build houses come into the city. And Mr. Berg would represent his clients. I'm going to speak for you a little bit.
Okay, well, you're doing a great job.
Mr. Berg would represent the very best deal he could get for his clients in that 400 acres. He would try to claw as much sewer money out of the city, as much road money out of the city, everything that he could hustle up for him, because that's what they're paying him for. All right? And that 400 acres becomes housing. And, excuse my expression, the knucklehead that owns the 32 acres or 40 acres, well, he's out in the county. And he can have the county sheriff take care of his problems instead of, like up where Mr. Terry is, the city cops go out in the woods and take care of the problems. It'll be the county's problem. It won't be ours anymore because it's forest land. Sorry. Yeah. There's people out there that will take advantage of this. They may not jump on it in the first 18 months, but somewhere out there, there's somebody sitting on some dirt. And if we can reach them and swap out, they'll build. And they don't care about what's going on with all these people that have speculated or invested or inherited or whatever you want to call it that are sitting here in Coos Bay. They care about getting their 400 acres done. And they'll make an effort to jump through the hoops to do it. Sutherland hops, by the way. I don't know if you realize that. Sutherland, they build like crazy. I think Amy could probably tell you that. They put up houses like there's no tomorrow there. Okay.
Well, while we're at
I
it,
would
it
just
would
add-
be good to streamline that program.
That's kind of where my mind's at, is trading, exchanging, what have you. Won't development still be the same difficulty, with what we're dealing with now?
Can I, Chair, just really quickly, I just wanted to add just two quick thoughts. One is that I don't think it's certainly not our intention to characterize a land exchange as a no-brainer, slam dunk. I think communities are looking more and more at it. We've heard that from DLCD. It's, in some ways, it's a measure of just how complex the UGB expansion and some would suggest how broken that process is, that communities are looking to this alternative. It's not easy. It's just another method that communities that have not been able to show a clear deficit of 20-year land supply can look at. And so that's one point. And then the other one is that, again, when the expansion is pursued, there are very strict criteria that precipitate from statute and rule on how, so it's not necessarily hand raising and who's in, it's an exercise of looking at quite a few variables. And so just wanted to reiterate that dynamic. So thanks.
What about rezone? Have you guys looked into areas that could be rezoned residential?
So the 2020 exercise, 2021 code and plan updates, rezone isn't the right word, but there were a lot of changes made to provisions within zones that in a certain sense rezoned. There was nothing that took lands of a different kind and made them explicitly residential. So that is not an exercise that has been undertaken by this process.
But if I could add to that, Jake, most of the commercial zones in the city allow multifamily residential.
I was thinking more forestry, but yeah.
So, while they were not technically rezoned, when you add new uses, residential uses, you've now expanded their potential for housing that was not there before. So I think that was a pretty big deal. Yeah, you opened up some of those areas.
Okay. Well, hearing no further public comment, we'll be, continuing this in our October meeting. So we'll just be tabling this for now. So we'll just be leaving the public hearing open. Any further comment to close it out? No? All right, hearing none. I guess we'll go to commissioner comments, staff comments.
I just have the one comment that we'll talk about this again in October. I don't believe there are any other agenda items for that meeting, and we will make sure that the minutes from this meeting are on your next meeting agenda as well.
Perfect, thank you.
And that's all I have.
All right, any further comment? No? Meeting adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Jake.